The FTC drew a lot more attention during the tenure of President Biden's FTC chair, Lina Khan. She was known for aggressively pursuing lawsuits against big corporations and introducing novel antitrust theories. Even some conservatives, dubbed conservatives, backed her moves, such as J.D. Vance. Khan hit the campaign trail with multiple Democrats in 2024, including Senator Bernie Sanders, then Senator Ruben Gallego, and a handful of others. Former chief technologist of the FTC, Neil Chilson, wrote on X, "The strongest policy justification for independent agencies has always been their bipartisan apolitical operation. Historically, the FTC has exemplified this ideal. However, the Biden administration undermined this rationale by steering the FTC deep into explicitly political territory. While Congress possesses numerous mechanisms to oversee and check the executive branch, the Constitution does not authorize Congress to combine legislative, judicial, and executive powers into an unaccountable, Frankenstein-like fourth branch of government."
Meanwhile, former Secretary of Labour Robert Reich wrote on Blue Sky, "The FTC has pending lawsuits against Amazon, Meta and Google. Trump is trying to gut the FTC by firing 2 Democratic commissioners. The National Labour Relations Board is fighting against Amazon and SpaceX in court for violating workers' rights. Trump tried to gut the NLRB. See the problem here? Stephen, I had first word on the last segment, so why don't you tell me what you think of all this?
Yeah, I think what Neil Chilson said was pretty important to point out. Let's take the big picture here first. Mm-hmm. So the Trump administration, we've talked about relitigating many of the balances of power between the different branches of government, are looking at independent agencies, which arose in the early 20th century and some in the late 19th century, and saying this was always a break with the constitutional order of the United States. Darwinism led to progressivism, which led to this sort of rise of the belief that expert classes and independent agencies, the experts, were going to better make policy in the United States over the legislative branch, where the unwashed masses who represent the people don't make the smartest policies based on facts or evidence. And that's where these agencies come from. There is sort of this fake belief that they can somehow be non-political. And Lina Khan's tenure was a wonderful reminder of just how political these agencies really are. I mean, the language of Slaughter and Bedoya when they're sort of, casting themselves as members of the resistance. I mean, these two people are going to have MSNBC contracts before you know it.
So the only part of that I agree with, I think, is the possibility of them having MSNBC contracts. It does surprise me in this case that conservatives are defending a move that seems to me to breach the separation of powers, which conservatives typically revere, because the FTC was set up by Congress and was the legislation that was enacting it was set up by Congress, and Trump is now proposing to cut across that. And to the point about politicization, it's worth noting, and stick with me here as we go back in time for the Supreme Court case, the precedent that is being cited here, which is beautifully known as Humphrey's Executor versus the United States.
That's a triumphant name.
Which pertains to a former Republican congressman who was appointed to the FTC by a Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, and reappointed by Herbert Hoover, and then FDR came in and said, yeah, I don't really agree with you, you can leave. Yeah. And the reason it's called Humphrey's Executor is then he then died, and his next of kin sued for back pay. But the Supreme Court held that it was completely valid to restrict the grounds upon which a president can get rid of a member of the FTC for reasons other than those specifically outlined in the law.
And the Trump firing notice, I think, actually really exposed them. When he said that your priorities do not align with that of my administration, this is a problem. And I think that this will actually lead to real complications for their case in court. So people who view this the way that I do largely see a litigation of an issue that needs to be fought out. This balance of power between the three branches of government and this sort of invisible bureaucratic fourth branch of government needs to be fought. but often the Trump administration does these things in a way that could lead to ultimate defeat. It is not legal to fire them based on policy priorities. You can sort of argue that they are not doing the job, and they're going to have to argue that those two commissioners and the Lina Khan FTC abandoned the purpose of the FTC, which was consumer protection, and reoriented it towards fighting oppressive corporations and the role of corporations in society, which these are fans of the early trust-busting movement. It's very romantic to these people, and you can see it in their language and their objection to being fired. But this might actually reveal to judges who look at this case that they have not been doing what that agency is supposed to do. And that same Supreme Court ruling said that the FTC was quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial,
right.
And it really does set up the FTC for the possibility to be gutted.
I think in defense of the FTC, the most recent figures we have are from 2024, when they returned more than $300 million to consumers. And I think there is, of course, a valid role to be played by those kinds of agencies because, as with the CFPB, often individual citizens do not simply have the financial wherewithal or certainly any legislative leverage to fight against genuine wrongdoing. And that's where I think we probably disagree on the role for regulation itself.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I'm not against the FTC existing. There are certain institutions that are just so baked into American life. I think you need to make the most of them. And the FTC does need to be reoriented towards the consumer welfare standard. And again, under Lina Khan, what the standard became was that antitrust law was going to focus on workers, suppliers, innovators, and entrepreneurs. That's not what the agency is supposed to do. It's what makes going after Amazon so stinking difficult for the FTC, because consumers are actually kind of liking big corporations like Amazon. They have a good relationship to the company. They get things for cheap. And so fighting this out is going to be tough.
You're breaking with the conservatives, though, here. So that's